Already on this channel, we've told the story of multiple battles that have happened in My Hero Academia's final war arc, and most recently we told the story of the traitor mini arc that leads into the beginning of the battle. So now we're going to tell the full story of All For One's battlefield in the final war, including how Endeavor low-key surpassed All Might in this section of the story. So let's discuss the characters that don't make it, all the quirks that All For One is going to steal, and how things take a turn that are even outside of All For One's predictions. The first phase of this final battle between all of the heroes and the villains was getting everyone in one location. So Deku was used as bait, and All For One appeared in front of him and released all of his villains using his warp quirk, while all of the heroes also showed up on Deku's side thanks to Monoma copying Kurogiri's quirk. And as the heroes activated a trap that they had waiting for the villains, in our last part we described how everyone got teleported to different areas, and All For One specifically was teleported to Gunga Mountain Villa, the original headquarters of the Paranormal Liberation Front that we saw being raided in My Hero Academia Season 6. And as everyone starts coming out of the portals, we see All For One floating in the air, with heroes like Endeavor there, Kamui Woods, Hawks, Tokoyami, and a lot of others who are also there to deal with all of the Nomu that have also been teleported to this location. But right as soon as we get there, we see that Hawks instantly goes in for an attack on All For One. He's still kind of nerfed from the fact that Dabi burned his wings in Season 6. Hawks comes here equipped with some brand new swords, and he instantly wants to try them out, and there is still a special one that he keeps tucked away for a later moment. Now Hawks strikes All For One on the mask, trying to break it right away since he knows that that likely is All For One's life support system, but All For One's new mask is incredibly sturdy, and it's not going to be easily broken. Endeavor and Hawks seem to be the two leaders of this operation against All For One, and they explain to All For One that they picked this location specifically because they know about his warp quirk, and they wanted to split up all the villains in different areas that were far away enough that he couldn't just use that quirk to undo everything that they did. So right now, All For One, even if he wanted to, couldn't just teleport away to another location. He's pretty much stuck here. And it's here where All For One starts taking digs at Endeavor, and things start getting personal very quickly. Because All For One's like, oh, that's cool, you split up all the villains, but you know by doing that, you also split up all the heroes, and you guys have a really dwindling resource of that at the moment. And if that's the case, then that means the only person left to deal with Dabi is Shoto, I suppose. How cruel, Endeavor, you leave your own two sons to clean up your mess. Now elsewhere, as All For One says, the battle between Dabi and Shoto is underway, and we did tell the full story of that battle on the channel already, as well as the sections of Dabi's backstory that were included during this part of the story. Now as a massive battle starts to break out between heroes and Nomu and different villains on the ground under Endeavor, Hawks, and All For One leads Endeavor and Hawks on a wild chase through the skies and the mountains of the Gunga Mountain Resort, with them unable to land a meaningful attack on him for quite a while. But this all changes when the news of the Dabi versus Shoto fight comes in over the hero communication system. The news comes in that apparently Shoto managed to take down Dabi without killing him. And Endeavor just kind of floats in the air making a face, and it's not really clear what kind of face it is, with even All For One commenting, "What's with that face? Is that relief? Is it sorrow? You couldn't even look at your son in the eyes. You just left little Shoto to go deal with him. So what's the matter? Wasn't this your plan in the first place? Don't tell me you're gonna justify it by saying something like, well, heroes have a lot to protect and I had to fight you. No, you could have been there when your sons were fighting, but you decided to come here and fight me. And that's why you're gonna lose today." And as All For One starts saying this, we see Hawk starting to realize that this is All For One's tactic to pretty much break down Endeavor's spirit first, but then All For One puts one of his hands forward, and we see a different quirk on each of his different fingertips, showing that he's absolutely equipped for battle this time as he prepares all these different quirks to finally go on the assault. But not to be intimidated, Endeavor and Hawks move in, starting their attacks again on All For One. And we see Endeavor completely cloaked in flames with a large flaming fist overlaid over his already large fists. But this is when All For One flicks one of those fingers that has all of the quirks on it, and we see a bunch of like crescent moon projectiles, kind of reminding me of Upper Moon 1 from Demon Slayer, and all these projectiles go towards Endeavor and Hawks as Hawks starts dodging it, but Endeavor uses his Hell Curtain technique, which is a big curtain of fire that blocks all of these projectiles. From inside of the Hell Curtain, we see fiery feathers shooting out towards All For One, who manages to dodge them by jumping backwards, and as All For One is jumping backwards, he flicks his thumb up into the air, a different finger than before, and we see a bunch of black goo appear behind him, which materializes just in time to block a sneak attack from Hawks, who tried to fly around All For One and hit him in the mask with his double blades. And All For One says, "Trying to catch me off guard again, huh? And you used to call yourself fast. Not even Recovery Girl could restore your wings after what Dabi did to you, and here you are trying to outspeed me with those puny prosthetic wings." But unlike anyone else that we've ever seen All For One talking trash to, it seems like it has absolutely no effect on Hawks, who just puts on a really big smile at All For One saying, "Yeah, I guess it really is a pain, isn't it?" This was when All For One turns around and realizes that Hawks here is really just a distraction, and if he can't actually do any damage to All For One, the person he really needs to focus on is right in front of him, and that would be Endeavor, who slams into All For One with two giant burning fists, doing repeated burning punches on All For One that he has to use all of his focus to block. And All For One flicks his ring finger forward, which is already covered in flame, and he uses a quirk called Pressurized Flame Curtain, mixed with another quirk called Impact Coil. But despite using these two quirks together specifically to counter Endeavor's flames, it really isn't having that much of effect. Endeavor's flames are slowly getting through to All For One in this rapid assault. And to make things worse, you have Hawks literally flying around like Rock Lee doing the Hidden Lotus, hitting All For One all over with these swords, and using the few feathers that he has to block any of All For One's little counterattacks that he's trying to do against Endeavor. But All For One starts to realize that there are actually little slips in Endeavor's attacks, and there's a little bit of a desync between Hawks and Endeavor here. They're not completely in unison, which lets All For One know that something is wrong with Endeavor. Endeavor isn't actually putting all of his heart into this because he's focused on something else. So All For One starts to talk about all the heroes and students who are single-mindedly battling on the ground, but apparently Endeavor's the only one that's allowed to have his mind elsewhere. Why is it that he keeps worrying and thinking about his little masterpiece finally defeating his failed experiment? And as All For One's flame shield gets even bigger and Endeavor isn't actually able to hit him anymore, he starts to laugh at Endeavor and saying, "Shouldn't you be a little bit happier? If you want me to be honest, I've always been fascinated in your twisted lust for power. I've always had my eyes on you. Do you think that I was only looking at All Might and not the people around him?" And as Hawks screams to Endeavor to ignore everything that All For One is saying and remember what happened to All Might and Camino when he got distracted, Endeavor rushes in for a powerful attack on All For One, but All For One continues speaking with his flame shield up, saying, "Listen, anytime that I see the opportunity to create a villain, I do that. I love planting seeds whenever I stumble upon fertile soil. And if you need any better proof than that, why do you think that Toya's body was never found?" Upon hearing this, Endeavor's face completely fills with like blank despair. He looks broken, like something just breaks inside of him, realizing that All For One probably isn't lying here, and that All For One was the one that found Toya's body, meaning that Endeavor really could have found him and things didn't have to go this way. And as Hawks thinks about how this manipulation is working on Endeavor and how he needs to stay by Endeavor's side, he starts floating up to Endeavor, who has like a fire tornado forming around him as he screams All For One's name, and we see that final finger that All For One hadn't used yet chomping through Endeavor's side as it turns into a giant mouth with all these like drilled horns on it, and All For One says, "Got him." And as Endeavor is down and starts crashing down to the ground, Hawks uses his remaining feathers to catch Endeavor and try to put him in Prominence Burn range, but he realizes that he can't dodge All For One's next attack, which is going to be a massive air burst like the ones that we saw Shigaraki using during the War Arc in Season 6. So Hawks is in some real danger here as he's about to take this attack full force, but then something unexpected happens. Right as All For One releases his full power air burst technique, we see two people gliding in the air behind Hawks, and it's actually Tokoyami and Jiro, as Jiro uses her heartbeat wall to actually block All For One's technique and create a pocket of safety for Hawks. And Hawks is very thankful that he was saved, but he screams to Tokoyami and that girl from Class A, whose name he doesn't know, to stay away from this battle because they'll absolutely die if they try to fight All For One. However, Tokoyami responds, "Look, I know I'm no Endeavor, but you know that I can fight alongside you." As he says that, somehow through the mask, we can see that All For One does look pretty annoyed, saying that there's so many flies buzzing around here, but this kind of reminds me of those comics that I used to read when I was younger, where side characters like you only showed up to show how powerful the Demon King being actually was when he took you down. However, not taking this old man seriously, we see Jiro telling All For One that that's really something that's better said after he wins, and now suddenly the battle between Jiro and All For One begins, a turn that I'm sure not a lot of people saw coming. Endeavor crashes to the ground holding his side as blood spills out of his mouth, thinking just what on earth is it that I'm doing? I know better than to let him get to me, but still, how could I let myself fall this far? All of this is still my responsibility. Everything that's happened until now, it's all on me. I can't put it on him, and I can't get angry at him for it. So I need to clear my mind and get back up there and help my friends. And at the same time, Hawks realizes that he's in a situation where he honestly needs all the help that he can get, so he's gonna have to take it from Tokoyami and Jiro in this instance, because all he needs to do is buy time for Endeavor to get back into the air to end this fight against All For One. But All For One at the same time realizes the same thing and tries to find a weak spot in their defense. So his arm swells up really big and we see a bunch of snakes forming in his palm with human teeth, and he compresses them in his arms before sending him out towards Jiro at a rapid speed. However, two of Hawks' feathers actually make it to Jiro in time, knocking her off of Tokoyami and floating her in the air to dodge the attack. All For One turns to look for Hawks, really annoyed saying his name, but two feathers hit him in the back of the head, and then as he turns to react to that, Hawks comes flying in from in front of him where he was just looking and hits him in the face with both of his blades using a spinning attack. But still, All For One's mask doesn't break. Jiro lands back on Tokoyami's back absolutely trembling, and she says to herself, Midoriya, Aoyama, so this is what you've been dealing with all this time? How terrifying. But All For One, being as observant as ever, goes, you're shaking, you poor thing. Did you think this was some sort of field trip? And he unleashes a massive attack in Jiro's direction that it doesn't seem like Hawks actually has time to react to. And at the same time, with his other arm, All For One sends out an attack towards Hawks, really giving him a choice to either dodge or try to save the UA students. And of course, Hawks being the hero that he is, he completely takes All For One's attacks, using all of his remaining feathers to move All For One's other arm slightly out of the way so that the attack would miss Jiro and Tokoyami. But it doesn't actually necessarily miss them, with the attack still hitting part of Jiro's face and taking out one of her ears. And as All For One makes fun of Jiro for thinking that she's a main character because she rubs shoulders with all these other impressive people, Jiro says, all you do is talk about who's weak and who's strong, who's special, who can do this and that. Listen, I don't really care about any of that. All I know is you made my friends cry, so you're gonna have to pay for it. And as she says this, using all of her emotions and all of her pain, Jiro lets out a massive heartbeat wall at All For One, kind of mimicking his giant air blast. And All For One prepares to counter this attack with a giant air blast of his own, saying that ability, motivation, spirit, all of that is useless and it's just for weak people. And all of that can easily be destroyed in the face of absolute power. So as All For One readies to just get rid of Jiro, who's this little annoyance on the battlefield, he finds that he actually can't use his quirk. And inside of All For One's vestige world, we see the different quirk users whose quirks he's already stolen actually grabbing All For One and holding him back, making him unable to do anything in this instance. And inside of the vestige world, All For One is absolutely confused to what's going on here, and he wonders if something happening with Shigaraki and New Order actually ended up causing this to happen, because why are the people inside of All For One fighting back against him now after all of this time? And it's here where All For One starts to realize that even a bunch of weak spirits, when they work together, can actually have an effect, because he has to take the full brunt of Jiro's technique here as Hawks dives in for one final attack using both of his vibrating blades, and thinks about how this entire time he's been hitting All For One's mask in the same exact place behind the head, trying to form a crack, which he has successfully done. So in this instance, when All For One is being hit by Jiro's attack, Hawks comes in and absolutely slams the blades into All For One's mask, breaking it and revealing All For One's face. And as this attack lands on All For One, Jiro, having 100% faith in Tokoyami, takes her jacket off and wraps it around Dark Shadow to give him even more darkness, and she literally just jumps off of Tokoyami's back in the air, saying, catch me in a second, but you have to do it now. And as she does that, we see Tokoyami and Dark Shadow flying in and forming a massive black fist, capitalizing on Hawks' attack to literally in one motion claw strike All For One in his face, sending him tumbling through the sky, as we see a massive smash sound effect, and All For One's mask gets completely shattered by Tokoyami. All for One gasps for air, trying to get another breath in, realizing that this is really bad, but the reason that he looks so confused is actually not just because he took that attack. All for One thinks to himself that he should have been able to dodge that strike with ease, but his senses are lagging behind. He actually wasn't able to see that the attack was coming his way. And I know you probably think, yeah, that's obvious because All for One doesn't have any eyes, but according to All for One, he's stolen so many different sensory quirks that he can even detect tiny little vibrations in the air that give him better senses than anyone else on Earth. So normally, again, he would have known that this attack was coming, but something is off. Again, it seems like those quirks inside of his body are actually rebelling against him and hindering him in this battle. So we see All for One floating in the air, probably taking a second to enter his mind palace, and when he's in there, we see the inner All for One growing very large and grabbing the quirk users who are rebelling against him and swallowing them, causing chaos inside of All for One's vestige realm as Hawks is about to land the finishing blow to slice All for One's head and finally take him out. But in that split second before the blade actually connects with All for One finally comes back to his senses, screaming pathetic, and we see 1,000 of those long kind of red and black quirk tentacles that we've seen All for One and Shigaraki use, extending outwards from All for One's body and slashing everything in distance. And when that happens, Hawk, still somehow actually being very fast, gets in front of Tokoyami and completely blocks the attack from hitting him as all those different tendrils start piecing All for One's mass together from all the tiny little thousands of fragments. But what we see as All for One's mask is reforming is that Endeavor actually got in the way of Hawks and took the majority of All for One's attack, grabbing some of it and even punching the rest of his arm with no fire on it to try to block the attack from hitting his friend. And as Endeavor tries to get through all of these tendrils, one of the tendrils actually pierces right through Endeavor's elbow, taking one of his arms off. But now more resolved than he's ever been in his life, Endeavor pushes forward, ignoring all of the pain and ignoring everything as his eyes and his mouth go completely white, showing you that he's checked out and he's going to complete his goal. Endeavor blitzes forward towards All for One even still, seeing a version of himself that was much younger still in UA, looking at him saying, "You're even weaker than you were before." And young Endeavor really starts to speak to Endeavor, calling him a failure, saying your conditions, your atonement, your mistakes, and your responsibilities, all those things ever did for you were just expose how weak you really are, and they turned you into the pathetic excuse for a hero that you are now. Stop trying to think that you're on All Might's level. Think back to your origin. Remember when Dad tried to save that little girl from a villain and how they both ended up as nothing more than scorched lumps of flesh? Remember that being a failure is in your blood. No matter how jealous you are of All Might, the real Superman, no matter how you choose a hero name that actually meets hard work, everyone can see through how weak you are. And Endeavor stands up by grabbing the neck of his younger self in this vision, who says, yeah, you're never gonna be like All Might or Deku. All this time you've been fighting against your own weakness, and that's your own true enemy. Forget about being a better person. Forget about atoning for everything that you've done. Curse your own weakness like you have been your entire life, because overcoming that weakness is the only thing that you've been living for this entire time. And in that moment, we literally see Endeavor strangling and burning his past as he flies in with a rage towards All for One with one of his arms still missing, and the arm forms into a large giant flaming fist that he hits All for One with and actually does a lot of damage to the Demon King, saying that ending this fight is my responsibility and I'm gonna do that right now. All for One goes flying backwards, saying that was way too close. And he says that he knew that someone on this day would push him to his very limits, but he didn't think that it was gonna be Endeavor of all people to start giving him flashbacks of the fight that he had against All Might back on that fateful day. And as he prepares himself to take Endeavor's next attack, we see Endeavor floating in the air with a giant swirling mass of flames behind his arm as he readies what's gonna be an amazing strike against All for One, but All for One is like, you can't possibly clear that distance before I can dodge or set up some sort of defense, so I'm gonna be yo. And in that millisecond, we see All for One suddenly face to face with Endeavor, who suddenly is in front of him thanks to Hawks putting his feathers on Endeavor's back, enhancing his speed and making him go even faster. Endeavor lets a massive vanishing jet burn go that sends a pillar of flame down to the ground, and we see All for One literally with his his butt to the ground, looking up into the air, looking a little afraid, as his flame shield is now completely broken. As All For One lands, we see that he actually lands in the middle of a battle that was going on between Kamui Woods and a couple other villains, and Kamui Woods looks up in the air and sees a massive pillar of flame coming down his way, so he jumps out of the way and says, "Everyone, move!" And in that moment, Endeavor comes slamming down on top of All For One shields and literally breaks through them, grabbing All For One by the neck, dragging him along the ground in a massive burst of flames. And it's here where the mask once again breaks, with All For One not being able to keep it all together. So All For One comments that his body isn't really listening to him, so all he can really try to do here is grab Endeavor and steal his quirk. So All For One lifts his hands trying to grab Endeavor by the arm, but Endeavor looks to the side and actually shoots out some flaming fire laser beams from his eyes that completely singe and burn All For One's hand, so he can't actually make contact with Endeavor. Endeavor's eyes start smoking and he looks at All For One saying, "The only thing that your hand has ever done is destroy people's lives." And All For One yells back saying, "You've destroyed lives too," with Endeavor saying, "Yeah, Toya is really only the product of all of my errors. All the people that he's killed with his quirk, those are also all my responsibility. However, despite that, I can't change the past." And it's here where Endeavor starts shooting up into the air, reminiscent of what he did against the High-End Nomu. Endeavor thinks to himself that his wrath, his resentment, and even his retribution, all woven together, form the fabric of the future. But what is that future? In his mind, Endeavor thinks of Shoto, and he thinks of the endless possibilities that Shoto and all the other 1A students have. He even sees a vision of all of them looking older, with Shoto walking towards the rest of his classmates, all as the next generation of heroes. And Endeavor tells All For One that no matter what he did and what responsibility he bears, he has to be the one to bear the punishment for all of that, so it doesn't become an obstacle in the way of the future for Shoto and everyone else. So even if it means that Endeavor has to give his life, he's going to be the one to end this so he can keep looking over Toya and he can keep everyone safe. Even if that means to the very end, he just has to keep on hating himself. And as Endeavor says this, literally bear hugging All For One, he unleashes a point blank, full power, full blast Prominence Burn that looks like a massive burning sun in the sky. And as the fire finally starts to clear, we see All For One's body completely charred and starting to break apart, looking the worst that anyone has ever looked in the series, even worse than Shigaraki did when Endeavor did the same exact thing to him. And Endeavor is thinking, thank the Lord that's over, because I have nothing left. I'm completely gassed out. However, we already know that All For One doesn't have any sort of regeneration quirk, and even if he did, there's no surviving that attack that I just did unless he had a body exactly like Shigaraki's, which he didn't have any time to prepare since his escape from Tartarus because we took the doctor into custody. So as All For One's body literally starts turning into dust, we see Endeavor taking a sigh of relief, like, okay, my job is done here. However, that's when we hear Hawks screaming towards Endeavor, "Get away!" And to Endeavor's utter shock, he hears All For One start to speak. All For One says, "Did you really believe that I would step onto this stage in this final battle without an ace up my sleeve? You more than anyone should know that my body is completely useless. There's not really any point in preserving it anymore, so you know what? I want to try something. Let's see if my little experiment actually worked." And as everything goes black, we see a quirk erasing bullet falling into a realm of darkness, and as it falls, we see that All For One is actually picturing Eri, saying, you know, heroes aren't the only ones prepared to risk their lives, because villains are also the most dangerous when they're wounded. And as he says this, we see a giant grin appearing on All For One's face, as his ears and his eyes from before his injury against All Might starts to reform, as All For One has seemingly taken Eri's rewind quirk from the quirk erasing bullets, meaning that All For One is about to rewind to his prime, and everyone on this battlefield is absolutely screwed.